It's Friday, October the 18th at this Self-Society. This is the third projection for which of the candidates is going to win the 2024 general election in the U.S. coming up on November the 5th. I'm using a metric different from anything that I see currently out there. I'm using actual votes and using a multiplier. I'm not going to be using polling, but only actual votes in early voting, either by absentee ballot or in-person voting in the various battleground states. I have included in the battleground states Florida and Texas, as there seems to be some rumor out there that these two states may go to the Democrats. Although I think it's highly unlikely, we'll nonetheless look at those numbers. So what do I mean by a multiplier? So I'm taking the data from 2022's general election in terms of the habits. Did people vote by mail or absentee, in person early, or in person election day? As you can see here, about half of those voting for Donald Trump voted in person on election day. And since Donald Trump has been running for president back in 2016, and he's been promoting the idea that mail-in ballots are not reliable, most of the votes have been done in person. As you can see, up to 73% in 2022's midterm election. Whereas for Democrats, that changed to only 54% and 45% by mail or absentee. So I'm taking those numbers and extrapolating them into a multiplier for 2024's election. However, given that 2022 was a midterm election, I had to take into account that may be different for presidential elections. I couldn't use 2020 because COVID was raging throughout the globe, and thus it would make sense that most people would vote by mail or absentee. That showed up quite a bit, even 32%, nearly a third of Donald Trump's voters voted in person in 2020, despite COVID, despite Donald Trump's continual suggesting that absentee and mail ballots were unreliable, could be tampered with. And later on, it turns out that 68% of Donald Trump's voters voted in person, whereas for Biden, that was a mere 41%. So how am I going to take these numbers and extrapolate them to 2024? What I do is I take the general history of voting throughout time. I got it here somewhere. Here. I believe it's down here. This is from Pew, by the way. And that data suggests that there is a trend line, and unfortunately I don't have that page, but there is a trend line suggesting that before COVID, roughly 45% of voters voted in person, or by mail rather, and 65% or 55% voted in person. So I continue that trend line as it was changing about every 2 to 3% every election cycle. So taking that into consideration, it would appear that roughly 55 will vote by mail and 45 will vote in person. And what I mean by person is I'm saying in person on election day. But again, Republicans tend to show up more readily in person since Donald Trump and Donald Trump's running. I had to also factor that into account. Whereas Democrats, it's the flip. And so I come out with a spreadsheet, and on that spreadsheet you'll see on the top left hand corner is the state, and the number of people that have voted is in the pink on the right hand corner. And then there is what's called a multiplier. Adjusted mail-in and election voting or early voting is this particular column corresponding to Trump and Biden-Harris. So 40% is expected to vote early by mail or early voting, whereas 60% is expected to vote same day in person for Trump voters. For Harris voters, I'm expecting the flip of that. 60% to vote by absentee ballot or early vote in person, and only 40% on election day in person. That gives us a multiplier of 1.5 for Trump voters and 0.67 for Harris voters. I then take the current number of votes that have been cast up to now. For example, in the state of Pennsylvania, we've had 791,804 votes, and this broken down by Trump, Harris, and other. Now, of course, really it's broken down by Republican, Democrat, and other, meaning independent or some other party. And we're getting that data from NBC News's Decision 2024 website, as they're showing the current votes. For example, in the state of North Carolina, 37% so far have voted there in that state by mail or early in person are Democrat, 33% are Republican, and 30% are independent, neither Democrat or Republican. And that's what we have. So I'll use that number and do a multiplier. And that should give us an idea of who would be winning at this point in the election. Now, in the first video that I put up on this channel, it looked like Donald Trump was going to win by winning the state of Michigan and North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, Florida, Texas, and Georgia. And Wisconsin went to Kamala Harris, and I'm guessing it has something to do with the Waltz effect. And then Pennsylvania went over to Kamala Harris as well. Now, in the second video, that changed. Michigan switched over to Kamala Harris, giving her the blue wall. And that's in the second projection that I put up a couple days ago, so if you want to check that out. And that set Kamala at 270 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 268, giving her a squeak, barely being able to squeak by to win election. Now, in this video, let's take a look at the numbers and put in the corresponding states. So let's go ahead and start first with the state of Florida. Let's go ahead and or Texas. Let's go ahead and, this is the one I think will be least likely to go to Kamala Harris. So far, 114,000 votes, and at least those have been cast and counted. 48% of those were GOP and 45% Democrat and 7% other. So although this is very early on, at this point, Donald Trump is expected to get 57.42% of the vote if the election were held today, and I'm taking into account the multiplier, whereas Kamala Harris get 35.89 and 6.7 other. Now that other could go to Democrat Harris or it could go to Republican Donald Trump, but even if all of this went to Harris, she still would not win the state. But we're expecting probably up to 7 to 8 or 9 million total votes for the state of Texas, so this is very early on. But at this time, I'm going to go ahead and give the state over to Donald Trump, giving him 189, whereas Harris has 226. Now let's move on to our next state, which is the state of Florida. And in that state, so far, we've had 833,511 votes cast and counted. Of those, GOP is 37% of those votes, where Dems is 43% of the vote, and 20% going over to other. And despite that lead of 6% early on, because of the multiplier, Donald Trump is still on track to receive about 45% of the vote, where Harris is on track to receive 35% of the vote. That's not counting the independents, though. But even with that 20%, it still would be very difficult, because Harris would have to receive 3 out of 4 of that 20% of other in order to just tie Donald Trump. So I think it's highly unlikely at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and give the state of Florida over to Donald Trump. And that brings it up to 219 for Trump and 226 for Harris. Now let's go over to the next state I think will be least likely to go to Donald Trump, and that is the state of Nevada. Right now, we don't have a lot of data coming out of the state of Nevada. As a matter of fact, there's only been a little over 10,000 votes cast. vast majority of those, 48% of those, going to GOP. Now, of course, I'm presuming that if you vote GOP, all of those votes will go over to Donald Trump. If you vote Dem, all those votes will go over to Kamala Harris. But there's some rumor out there that roughly anywhere from 6 to 9% GOP will lean toward Harris, and about 3% vote of Democrats' votes will lean over, or Democrats will lean over to Trump, giving us a difference of about 3 to 6%, or roughly rounded off 4.5%, so I'll just say 5% of the GOP vote going over to Harris. Although I really think that that's highly unlikely, but even with that 2%, it wouldn't be enough for her, because with this model, we're projecting Donald Trump receives 56% of the vote, Harris receiving 20% of the vote. And of course, 25% are unaccounted for at this point because it's under the category of others, so we don't know how this is going to split up. But let's say that Harris received all 24%, along with the 20%, that's 44%, and she then gets the additional 5%. Well, she's still setting at 50%. Means Nevada goes clearly over to Donald Trump at this time. So that now brings it up to 225 to 226. Very, very close, right? The next state we're going to look at is the state of Georgia. Now, I think Georgia is likely to go to Trump more so than Arizona, but let's go ahead and take a look. The numbers in Georgia tell us. In the state of Georgia, so far, there have been a cast of over 900,000 votes. Of those, 47% have gone to GOP, 48% to Dems, and about 5% to other. And that means that with our multipliers, Donald Trump is expected to receive over 56% of the vote, where Harris will receive around 38%. So I'm expecting that the state of Georgia at this time is going over to Donald Trump, giving him 241, Harris 226. Then moving on to our next state, which I think is the state of Arizona. And we see in the state of Arizona that so far there's been 174,000 plus votes cast. Of those, 45% of those have gone over to GOP, 34% to Dems, and 21% under the category of other. Even if we counted both these together, it still would not be enough to compensate for the lack of votes she has compared to Trump. So at this point, Donald Trump is winning that state, giving him 252 to Harris 226. Now let's go ahead and move over to our next state, and I'm going to go ahead and go to the state of North Carolina. And in that state, the numbers tell us that there have been a huge number of votes cast thus far, about 428,000. Of those, 33% GOP, which Dems have had 37%. And interestingly, a good 30% consider themselves as other than Dem or Republican. So, this is a state that it will probably come down to the wire before we will be really clear whether or not Harris or Trump will win. But at this time, Trump has a very hefty lead with our multiplier, well over 40% to Harris's 30%. So even if I were to take into account, let's shave a couple off of Trump, he would be at 38, Harris 32, and let's say we split it, then of course Harris is not going to win. Harris would have to receive again a substantial amount of the independent vote to get North Carolina. So at this time, I think it's going to go to Trump. So Trump's at 268, Harris at 226, meaning at this point, Donald Trump is just 2 away from being reelected to the White House. And then moving to our next state, I'm going to go to the state of Michigan. And in the state of Michigan, so far there have been a total of 855,000 plus votes cast. A very substantial percentage of those are Dems, 54% to GOP's 36%. However, you can see with our multiplier, it is exactly tied at 45%. So what do we do in this instance? Well, we look at the independent vote, the remaining 10%. And the reality is that historically, at least in the past 4 to 5 elections, and the last 3 elections that have all been GOP's candidate being Trump, a good 60-70% of independent votes would go to the Democrat. So there's some degree of favor of the independent vote going over to the Democrats over going toward Trump. Now that may change this year, but at this time, I'm going to say that we have a very slight margin in favor of Harris, which then means that at this time, I'm going to just very tentatively give her the state of Michigan. At a 283, that gives her 241 to Donald Trump's 268. Next, let's go over to Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, there have been 283,000 plus votes cast. Of those, 19% to GOP, 40% to Dem, and 41%, the largest group, is under the category of other. So the state is still a toss-up. However, at this point, if you only look at the Dems, how that the Dems have voted, and the GOP that we know identify with that party, 34% of those have expected to get that vote after the multiplier to be Dem, and a little over 24% for Trump. So this time, the state of Wisconsin goes to Kamala Harris, giving her a total of 251 to Trump's 268. Well, this time it comes down to Pennsylvania with the 19 electoral votes. And in the state of Pennsylvania, right now, there have been a total of 791,000 plus votes cast. Out of those, 26% have been GOP, where 65% have been for Dems, about 9% for other. So even with the multiplier heavily favoring Donald Trump, it looks like it'd be very hard for him to take the state of Pennsylvania at this time, if past voting trends continue. Currently, we're expecting Harris to receive 56% of the vote to Donald Trump's 34% of the vote, clearly giving her the state of Pennsylvania at this time. So with that, it does mean that Kamala Harris is expected to barely make it into the White House with 270 compared to Trump's 268, a very divided United States of America. Now, the other thing we want to take a look at before we close in this particular projection for today is I want to look at some of the trends that we've seen in the past. You can see that in 2020, 57% of women, or 57% of Biden's votes were women, whereas for Trump, it was 42%. And then for men, 53% for Trump, 45% for Biden. And the groups, 52% of all votes cast were from women and 48% from men. That's a 4% difference. So that's one trend we want to pay attention to. So we'll look at that just in a second. The other one we want to pay attention to is notice that the white vote was 67% of the total, and it favored Trump by a good 17% compared to Biden's 41%. And then African Americans, 87% for Biden, 12% for Trump. Well, this year, the trend is moving for African Americans and Hispanics is moving toward Trump. At least that's what the early, pundits are suggesting. And if that's true, he's expected to get anywhere from 16 to 20%, and Hispanics anywhere from 35 to 40%. And then for whites, there's some shifting away from Trump toward Harris or the Democrats, and they are expected to get anywhere from 45 to 50% of the total white vote. Now, bear that in mind. If it turns out that African American Hispanics lean in toward Trump more than ever in the past, and whites lean the other direction, they might kind of wash each other out. As for Asian and other votes, they're expected to pretty much remain the same for Asians, and Trump may pick up 1 or 2 additional percentage points at this time. Now, lastly, like I said, let's look at the current trends on the national level of the early vote. So far, there have been well over 10 million votes. As far as gender, 53% of those have been women, 45% of those have been men, and then 2% unaccounted for. So if I split that in half, 1% going to GOP, or to men rather, and 1% going over to women, it'll be 54 to 46%. That means this year more women are coming out to vote than did in 2020, meaning that likely will favor Harris over Trump. However, even despite that, our current model suggests Harris barely makes it into the White House with 270 votes to Trump's 268. So that's it for this particular video. If you liked this particular model and format, be sure to thumbs up and subscribe. And feel free to comment. Is there anything else you'd like to see or to be addressed in the next video? Hopefully we'll have enough data that I'll be able to put up another projection tomorrow. Good day.